Okay, guys, I'm back after tapering that plank, which you can see here. It's tapered now from 1/4 of an inch on this end down to, I'd say, a little bit more than half its original width. Now, there are a lot of books written on this subject, and I imagine you guys have read a lot about planking. And yes, they will all tell you that a plank should be tapered now or as it goes into the stem rabbet, but that's usually as far as they take it. Then they just say glue it into place. Now, there's a lot more to it than that, and usually that's just left up to model builders to figure out. It took me several projects before I figured out what needed to be done to get a plank to lay nicely and flat against all the bulkheads. So at any rate, as you know, the hull here curves this way. It also curves this way towards the stem rabbet, and the only way to get this to lay flat is if the plank was bent in a curve to conform to the strake that's already on the hull. So how do you do that? Well, normally, if folks haven't discovered this yet, they'll just try, and let me stick this into the stem rabbet here, and just use it as is, a nice straight plank, and then they try and force it into position. But hopefully you can see this on the camera if I haven't screwed up where it's pointed, that when you do this, the top end wants to pull out quite a bit, about a good 1/16 of an inch, if not more, and most model builders will do everything they can to force this and push this flat against each bulkhead. And they'll try drilling some holes and pinning it, or using weird clamps and tons of glue, and it just becomes a mess, and the plank's split. And you really should be able to lay this plank in here so that it sits nice and flat against the bulkheads with little effort whatsoever, and that's going to require bending it in a U this way. It's going to be bent in this direction so that it'll sit nicely against the edge that's already on here, and also sit really nice and flat against the hull. So how do you determine the shape of that curve? Now, the traditional way that this is done is builders will cut the curved plank from a flat sheet. They'll get a wider sheet. They'll either use a wide piece of tape here that they could draw a line to determine what the curve is, transfer it to the sheet, and then cut it out. But that's problematic in that it does take a long time. It's kind of nitpicky. What if you don't get the curve exactly right? So I abandoned that idea, mostly for expediency and the fact that this method works so well. So the way that I determine the curve is by simply laying it, and you don't have to even stick it in the rabbet at this point, just laying it across the hull so you can see the gap that remains between the new plank and the planking that's already on the hull. And then you want to look for its widest point, which you know is going to be the bottom or the center of the curve, and you want to mark that location. And in my case, I've kind of determined that it's going to be about here. Now, if we get this wrong and we curve this plank and it doesn't fit as nicely as we need it to be, well, then you can just take it back to our bending station and bend it again. So that's about it. And the only other thing I would mention is that when you take this over to your bending station, you got to remember which way to bend it. And so usually I'll put a little arrow in here to indicate that that's going to be the bottom of the U, so I don't bend it the wrong way, which I usually do half the time anyway. So let's take this over to our bending station, and I'll show you how I go ahead and bend this using heat.